Wonderful. Welcome everyone to our discussion on gender diversity and transgender identities in the autistic community. We're really grateful that you all have taken a little bit of time out of your day to join us. We are going to spend the next little while talking with a very esteemed lineup of panelists. And we're really grateful for them giving of their time to join you all and to join us for today's webinar. And before I go any further, I want to wish everyone a really happy Pride Month. It has been a rough time for the LGBTQI+ community, unfortunately. So it's all the more important that we're able to connect and share resources such as the webinar here. I'm gonna start things off by taking a little bit of time to connect and get to know everyone. I will read folks' bios and we can therefore get to know our panelists. I will start off in order of how folks are appearing on my screen. I will start off with Xīnzhèn Zhǎngsūn Brown, who uses they, them pronouns. Xīnzhèn is an internationally recognized advocate, a community organizer, community builder, and a scholar activist whose work addresses interpersonal, corporate, and state violence that targets disabled people at the intersections of race, class, gender, sexuality, faith, language, and nation. They have worked for over 15 years as a committed advocate, a community organizer, and a policy expert at the nexus of disability rights and disability justice. And they have also run for public office in Maryland. Disability justice and abolition are their political homes. As an organizer, as a feminist critical legal studies scholar, they work in critical race and disability studies at Georgetown University. They are the founding executive director of the Autistic People of Color Fund, which is a trans, BIPOC, and director of a trans BIPOC led organization. They are also the director of public policy at National Disability Institute, and recently they were appointed to serve as a commissioner on the Maryland Commission on LGBTQI+ affairs. A very warm welcome. Next up on my screen, I have Jess L. Wilcox Coing, who uses they, them pronouns. Jess is a multiply disabled scholar and educator who teaches disability studies and gender studies at the college level. Their research is in the areas of 19th and 20th century literary studies, feminist disability studies, and settler colonialism. Their work is published in the Journal of Feminist Scholarship, Disability Studies Quarterly, and CUSP, late 19th, early 20th century cultures. Jess grew up on Wabanaki homelands and lives and works in Piscataway homelands. Really glad to have you today to join us. And next up, we have Victoria Rodriguez Rodan, who I don't have a bio for. So I'll let Victoria introduce herself.
I pasted the bio in the document. Do you not have it?
I don't, somehow.
It doesn't appear for me either.
In the bios tab?
Oh, I think you might be on a different form. We all posted them in the Google form.
It's in the link.
Or sorry, the Google document.
It's okay. It's
Would you like me to read it? I could go ahead and read it.
Yeah,
let me
go ahead.
Find
I tend to be very modest, for good or bad.
Okay, great. Next up, we have Victoria Rodriguez Rodan, who uses she, her pronouns. Victoria JD is Maryland's coordinator of autism strategy. She is a nationally renowned openly trans and autistic self-advocate and proud Baltimore City resident. She has over a decade of experience in the government and nonprofit sector, having started in disability discrimination enforcement at the U.S. Department of Labor. Later, she founded the Disability Justice Project at the National LGBTQ Task Force, the first national effort dedicated to LGBTQ people with disabilities, with a special focus on both mental health and IDD, and both populations of which LGBTQ people are historically underrepresented. She has worked extensively in matters impacting marginalized communities in various organizations and has been published in multiple legal journals on the intersections of disability and LGBTQ identity. She is a chapter author of the book, Sincerely, Your Autistic Child. Before being appointed by Governor Wes Moore to be Maryland's coordinator of autism strategy, she chaired the board of trustees at the Autistic Self-Advocacy Network, also known as ASGARN, during a multi-year period of dynamic transition for the organization, and sat as a member of the board of the Autistic Women and Non-Binary Network. She holds a law degree from the University of Maine School of Law and an undergraduate degree in psychology from the University of Puerto Rico. She is a 2011 Truman Scholar. Really grateful to have you here with us, Victoria. Next up, I have Robin Wilson-Beattie. Robin is a speaker and writer who uses she, her pronouns and an advocate for disability and sexuality. She was one of the first people to talk about disability, sexuality, and marketing to adult product retailers and manufacturers. Robin combines years of personal experience with medically sound research to provide a unique perspective on how disability, life, and identity impact one's sexual and reproductive health and expression. She is the 2024 Carrie Buck Distinguished Fellow of the Lurie Institute for Disability Policy at Brandeis University. Her speaking engagements include multiple keynotes, panels, workshops, and webinars, including the Executive Office of the Vice President of the United States, and 3 consecutive years speaking at the Adult Video News Convention in Las Vegas. As a disability peer researcher, she has co-authored a paper published in the Journal of American Medical Association. Her work on sexuality has been published in national and international news outlets, blogs, and magazines in the United States, England, and Italy. Robin's work has not only helped tens of thousands of disabled people, but also inspired many others to become advocates for sexuality and disability education, an incredibly underserved area. Robin is certified by the American Board of Sexology and the City College of San Francisco as a sexual health educator. She is also a member of the Association of American Sexual Educators, Counselors, and Therapists, also known as ASECT, and the Women of Color Sexual Health Network, and the abbreviation is WOCSHN, and a graduate and member of the San Francisco Sexuality Information Training, SFSI. She is a co-founder of the SPM Disability Justice Fund, and when not discussing sex, she enjoys being a mom of 2, renovating old houses, and heading off to the next adventure. Really grateful to have you with us today. And then myself, I'll be your moderator for today. My name is Lee Blinder. I use they, them pronouns. I am a proud, openly non-binary, transgender, and queer Marylander. I'm the founding executive director of Trans Maryland. We are a multiracial, multigender community power building organization for Maryland's trans community. I am also the first openly transgender chair of any Maryland commission. I'm also the first openly non-binary commissioner of any Maryland commission, or chair, sorry, of any Maryland commission. I served on Governor Wes Moore's transition team, and I sit on LGBTQI+ advisory boards around the state. I also facilitate Transgender 101 and gender affirming workplace training for government, medical organizations, and private companies. I am a member of the Maryland Judiciary's LGBTQ+ Family Law Work Group, and I've worked in service to my community for over 29 years. I helped to launch the the Gender and Sexuality Alliance, the GSA, at Montgomery Blair High School in 1996. And in my free time, I enjoy spending time with my adopted animal companions, my cat Basil Pasta Marinara, who may join us after she is done with her nap, and my dog Cupcake. So for today's webinar, we are really excited to have a robust discussion with, again, our esteemed panelists. And we can start off a little bit just diving on in and ask folks, and we can go with whoever would like to answer at this time in 2025. What do you think are the top 2 most urgent issues facing autistic trans people?
Not everybody at once.
Does that mean, Victoria, you'd like to take this one to start?
I mean, I would love for other people to answer, but in my case, I would say, like, as far as issues, it's misunderstanding. It's because oftentimes there's the perception that the stereotype of the white boy as the face of autism, when in reality it's much more diverse than that, and that the majority of, like, a disproportionate amount, I wouldn't say the majority, of people with in the autism spectrum are likely to be LGBTQ, and that is very much settled research at this point. And that also, if you support any type of self-determination around autism, that also has to mean that you shouldn't be restricting, for example, that you shouldn't be using autism as a barrier to gender-affirming care, to self-acceptance, to self-determination around LGBTQ identity. Like what I sometimes call Maryland values as the type of state that we are and how we vote in this state. But yeah.
Thank you so much, Victoria. Would anyone else like to share their thoughts on this question?
This is Xīnzhèn. Oh, go ahead, Robin.
Oh, no.
You go ahead.
Okay.
Go.
Well, one, I can think of like a couple of issues that I think that are very important and relevant in 2025. Well, healthcare, Medicaid, all that stuff. But the other thing is, I feel like there needs to be more support and education around people who are diagnosed as autistic later in life, as adults. I'm noticing that I'm someone who's in their 50s, and I just got diagnosed, late last year. And I there there are, especially like when you are a person of color, as a Black woman, it, because as Victoria had mentioned, the face of autism being presented as white, the face of it being white and male, but I feel like it, but yeah, but also it's being older and and finding out what does that mean, and that was one of the things that I'm thinking of that is very important, that I feel like there needs to be a lot more support and education, and ways for people to get that diagnosis or figure out if they access to that. There's like a lot more to that about, like, oh, the barriers in place when it comes to money and diagnosis and all self-diagnosis and all that other kind of stuff. But anyway, that's what I have to say.
Thanks, Robin. So you're really interested in kind of bridging the gap on some of the education and access to whether any kind of services, but particularly for folks who are experiencing a diagnosis later in life, and then also are for folks who are not the stereotype as been presented of someone who is white, young, and a boy, or a cisgender boy. Great. Xīnzhèn, did you want to go next?
This is Xīnzhèn. The two top issues, if we could distill it down to two, which of course, with our group, we could easily spend hours talking about the many urgent issues facing our community in 2025. But I would argue that it distills down to two themes. Both of them are connected to ableism, and ableism is the system of values that treats some people as fully human and deserving of life and deserving of rights and deserving of freedom, and that devalues other people as less deserving of human dignity, of life, of rights, of freedom. In other words, ableism, like any other systematic form of discrimination and marginalization, tells us that some people in society count as persons and other people don't. And that fuels what I would argue are those two most urgent issues. One is the resurgence of eugenics. Eugenics might be more commonly known or remembered as the pseudoscience, race science of the early 20th century that purported to be able to guess from skull size and nose shape which people of what races or ethnicities were more intellectually and physically capable, and which people were inferior or defective or just lesser. We might remember eugenics as the ideology that fueled the Nazi regime and the Holocaust in targeting Jewish people and queer people and Roma people and Polish people and disabled people, which is often forgotten and left out of retellings of the violence wreaked by the Nazi regime. But eugenics actually came from the United States, and it's still rooted here. And we see this in public policies and practices that are aimed at pushing transgender and disabled people out of public life, out of the community, while painting us as somehow both being so incompetent and vulnerable to manipulation that we need to be protected and saved, perhaps by institutionalizing us or forcibly treating us, and as so dangerous and predatory that we are the cause for the so-called degeneracy of modern society. Rhetoric that is really scarily familiar when we look back at the whole span of the last century's history. This resurgence of eugenics is what is fueling bans on gender-affirming treatment for trans youth and children. It is what is fueling attempts to criminalize what is alternately called cross-dressing, right? Or dressing in accordance with how one wants to appear on a particular day. Attempts to criminalize and roll back decriminalization of, say, living with HIV, of performing sex work, of loving someone of the same gender, of living in a body or putting on clothing that don't match the assumptions or expectations that were assigned to you based on what you looked like when you popped out of a uterus as a baby. And these are all deeply and closely connected policies. All of the rollbacks of rights and the attempts to roll back rights, the attempts to ban access to care, to ban access to support, to ban even asking for the basic respect of, say, asking for one's coworkers or teachers to call you by your chosen name, by the pronouns that match who you are and how you understand yourself. These are all just as related as our policies that are attempting to put people in prison for exercising autonomy over their body, over their choices, over what they look like and who they love and how they dress and what we want to do while living outside in the world in public. And closely related to this, right, this second issue, which I've also named, is the assumption rooted in ableism that autistic people in particular are incompetent, that autistic people are permanently infantile, that we should be understood as trapped in bodies that might age and become adults, but that are mentally the age of 4, or worse, mentally the age of 4 months old. And if autistic and other disabled people can be treated as permanently children, then it becomes that much easier to take away our rights and to say that you're doing so for our own good, while claiming that all transgender people are predatory, dangerous, brainwashing, and manipulating autistic children, and ignoring that autistic people of all ages also have the ability to exercise self-determination and understand our own bodies and our own genders and who we are, just like non-autistic people do.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate your kind of walkthrough of some of the history of where we've gotten to here, and how fascism is interwoven through all of this on both a historical basis and alluding to the issues popping up for us in real time right now. Jess, did you want to weigh in on this one as well?
Sure, I'll do so briefly. Yeah, Xīnzhèn and I are on the same wavelength. Like, I can't think of any other more urgent issue right now than trans and autistic youth getting access to gender affirming healthcare, and not just gender affirming healthcare, but gender affirming, life affirming, neurodiversity affirming healthcare. That overlap is hard to get, even in states where it is protected, states like Maryland, and completely absent in places where bans are already in effect. I had another thought related. Xīnzhèn laid it out so nicely. I don't really have anything to add to that, but I guess to offer like a slightly like related but different thing, access to mental health care as well, and specifically thinking of the historical context that Xīnzhèn laid out for us in terms of eugenics and just ableist forces, really undergirding the ableism that is so prevalent throughout the US healthcare system. Where was I going with that? Just supporting like agency and making medical decisions, right? Like supporting and affirming trans and autistic youth to make decisions for themselves, even if they change their minds, right? Even if like supporting their process. I have extreme brain fog today, so I am doing my best, but that is what.
Thank you, Jess. Yeah, we appreciate you showing up, brain fog or no brain fog. So we're always grateful to have everybody here in whatever capacity they are in the moment. I really appreciate everyone kind of touching through how these issues are coming up in both our professional or scholarly work, and then also the ways that we see them playing out for individuals in the communities that we serve. It really makes a big difference to weave those two together. I know the best public policy folks are the folks who are in touch with the communities that they serve, or ideally from the communities that they serve, and interwoven together. So it's such a joy to hear these perspectives. I think the other piece that I often find up too, that I don't know if anyone had specifically mentioned, is around our elders, who, we have such vulnerabilities, and particularly in a rights-based context. I'm grateful to you, Xīnzhèn, for talking about so much specific to our youth and infantilization of youth. But on a rights basis, I often say that for the folks who are lucky enough to be in a state like Maryland, where we do have legal protections, we are fighting generally to improve conditions in the state for LGBTQI+ people, and then specifically the trans community. And instead of like our siblings in other states who are fighting to not lose as badly as they often might, in their legislative and other public policy pushes. But, you know, so for young people, though, who are in the state of Maryland who have unaffirming parents, they're in the same boat as young people who have affirming parents in a state like Florida or Texas, et cetera. So that's sometimes nothing anybody here missed, but sometimes missed, you know, in these discussions around who has access to what. And then particularly for our elder folks, they are, you know, as long as they're not in a guardianship situation, you know, they have legal rights as an adult, because we don't give legal rights, you know, largely to minors, but they often, you know, due to where they're living and anti-LGBTQI plus, or specifically anti-trans policies or practices of where they might be living, you know, if they're in a, you know, retirement community or nursing home or something like that, where folks start to end up in a really vulnerable place. So I did want to make sure I mention that community. And I think someone had popped off mute to try to jump in. Happy to make a moment free if someone had something
I
else
was
to
just
add.
gonna point out basically that, I mean, trans healthcare and non-discrimination laws are very much protected here in Maryland, and that is very much, and it's supported by the administration that I serve. Shameless plug about my bosses, but I will just say that our mission is to make sure that society understands that for all autistic people who are also LGBTQ and whatnot. So yeah, that applies to everyone.
This
I
is
appreciate that.
Jen.
Yeah.
I would add and further that point, right? That guardianship, what many people do not know, is famously referred to as civic death. And it actually is an extension of the way that our legal system already treats the status of being a minor. So if you think back to when you were a kid in school, or if you have kids and you see what your kid brings home from school, permission forms for field trips or for seeing more sensitive content in a class experience will always have a signature line that says parent/guardian. And that's not just form language, that's there for a legal reason. And that legal reason is that unless a child is emancipated, and yes, that is the legal term referencing a person under the age of 18 being given their full adult civic rights at earlier than 18, if a young person is not emancipated, then the parent has the exact same authority as a person who is 18 or older who is under guardianship that guardian then has. A guardian holds the same legal authority to make medical, financial, or even everyday life decisions for that person under guardianship as a parent does over a minor. And looking back in history, again, to draw these threads together, guardianship is also the status that enslaved Black people were held in terms of ability to enter into contracts and to make decisions about any aspect of their lives, no matter how major or how minor, that were held under the control of white slaveholders. That white slaveholders functioned as the legal guardian of enslaved people whom they held captive. And so that same legal fiction that a person should be deprived of the right to make decisions for themselves because they're assumed incapable based on age or based on race or based on gender, as women in the United States, regardless of race, couldn't even open a credit card account until the 1970s without a male signatory co-signing for them, right? That regardless of the particular reason why, guardianship and the legal structure of being held as a minor and are very closely related, and they all tie back to ideas about who counts not just as human, but who has the capacity to understand their lives and make decisions for and about themselves and about their own body mind. So it is not any mistake today that we see this infantilization and presumption of incompetence impacting trans people who are disabled, autistic or otherwise, at all stages of life. Because whether or not you are actively placed under guardianship, which legally restricts all of your rights, the ability to exercise any autonomy, you are treated as presumptively incapable of making decisions. Like, to the point where I and people that I know who are my colleagues, regardless of what our tasks are, our jobs, our job titles, or what credentials we may or may not have been spoken to with a baby voice and patted on the back or the shoulders, or occasionally the head, because of this pervasive belief that even people who sometimes think that they are allies, which is upsetting in a whole other way, presume that we are still permanently children.
So I just want to point out on the concept of guardianship, the Autism Strategic Plan, well, in our end, we are not, we do not seek any abolishing of guardianship or whatnot. One of the priorities mentioned in the Autism Strategic Plan that we introduced, and it's meant to be the state's policy on autism, is effectively to try to reduce the use of guardianship to the absolute necessary cases, to the minimum necessary, absolutely necessary, and to encourage the adoption of the assisted decision-making models that already exist in Maryland law and were enacted a few years ago. So just putting that out there.
Thank you, everyone. And Jess, I'd seen your hand at one point. I don't know if you changed your mind.
I was just going to add on to what Xīnzhèn was saying. I will try not to keep us in history class too long. Also in response to what Robin was saying, but the way that ableism also works with all of these other things, cis heterosexism, racism, and thinking about guardianship, as you brought up, these all go back to very early ways that like, in addition to enslaved people, how Native Indigenous folks specifically were in like legal, they had a legal status sometimes in New England. I mean, this happened, I'm thinking specifically of Southern New England in the 18th and 19th century, but indentured servitude was a condition where that was used by the state and the government to put Native Indigenous youth essentially in, like, to place them, to designate them as wards of the state essentially, and place them in like model read like white, you know, well-to-do families. And this was always to generate family separation. And often this was enacted through claiming Native Indigenous families and kinship systems, right, that aren't recognized by the US as neglectful. And you can still see that in the language of foster care today, and how like incentives that different states have, South Dakota, for, you know, adopting out disabled children. I will
Awesome.
excited to hear this is it.
I was just gonna say, I am someone who did adopt out from the foster care system a child with a disability, and I remember somebody trying to tell me, no, you want to be a guardian and not adoptive parent because you get more money and more support, and I'm like, okay, no, but this is my baby and adopt, yeah, that whole guardianship thing, I was like, oh, interesting.
So many
Maybe we should go into the questions about the topic of queer identity on, because they're starting to get in the
Yes.
weeds of the history of guardianship and its problematic natures and overuse. Like I said, it's already state policy to try to minimize its use to absolutely necessary cases, but yeah.
Appreciate that. Well, we have so much amazing scholarship and talent here on this panel, so it's not surprising that we can go down quite a few rabbit holes. But I'll go ahead and, you know, as we're talking about some of the harmful structural intersections, that brings me to our next question. So various figures, particularly, you know, currently going on in the US are spreading the harmful idea that because trans people are disproportionately represented within the autism spectrum, that somehow is then proof, quote unquote, that trans youth don't really know what they want when they're seeking affirmation of their gender. And therefore, using autism as a barrier to gender affirming care and treatment. What do you all have to say in response to that? And I just kind of go down the row as I see folks on my screen. We'll start with Robin.
– No, we won't stop at Robin. Robin is still forming her thought. Can we please?
Okay, wonderful. We will start with Xīnzhèn.
This is Xīnzhèn. I spoke a little bit about this a few minutes ago, but again, to reiterate, it is so commonly believed that autistic people, especially when younger, but even when literally elderly, are incapable of understanding our own experiences, our own histories, our own lives, our own preferences, our own bodies, our own feelings. That the ableist belief pervasive in education, in healthcare, in social services, and even in most of our families is that everybody else knows better than us what's for our own good. Everybody else knows better than us what we need, what we want, and what would benefit us. And as a result, when autistic transgender youth attempt to lay claim to their reality, to their knowledge, to their truth, it is so common to be dismissed, to be told, you're not right, you couldn't possibly know that that's who you are. And if you're trying to say that you are transgender in any of the many possible flavors of transgender that exist, then clearly someone must have manipulated you or tricked you into believing that you are transgender, but you couldn't actually possibly be transgender. Someone must be using you for their own agenda rather than maybe you know something about yourself and you know something about your own life. But more than just disbelieving what someone states about their own experiences, this type of ableism can have far-reaching consequences that can not only endanger somebody's very mental health and mental well-being, but can also place a person at much greater risk for future abuse, for exploitation, for discrimination, and the compounded effects of it. So for instance, if a person is driven away from legitimate sources of support for expressing themselves and learning who they are and growing into their own, that person may turn to abusive relationships. That person may turn to groups of people who actually are harmful and dangerous in an attempt to find validation because they were dismissed and denied by the very people who were supposed to support, mentor, and care for them. That person may end up being disregarded and ignored by medical providers, which could lead to them refusing to seek medical care, even for acute, serious, or life-threatening conditions in the future because they were treated so terribly earlier in life. That person could end up living their life actively suicidal. And statistics show us that trans people are more likely to contemplate, attempt, or complete suicides than non-transgender people are. And that is undoubtedly due to experiencing repeated trauma, abuse, rejection, and denial of their true selves. And we know that access to gender-affirming care and access to support, or even being addressed correctly, are all forms of suicide prevention. Right? So like all of these consequences can snowball. And this is true even for the young people that, as Lee mentioned in their comments, might have supportive parents and family. Even if you have supportive parents or family, which is not a given for many people in our community, but even if you do, if you are denied the ability to live authentically, to be yourself, to have the opportunity to be safe and alive, then who's to say that you're ever going to be able to be successful in the future in having access to stable relationships, stable housing, stable income, any form of stability, because you were set up to be either shut out and excluded from those systems by design, or you were set up to be failed, to be exploited, or to be abused.
Thank you so much.
I'm gonna
Next up
be
on my, oh,
yeah, I can go. I mean,
okay,
I would
great. Go ahead, Victoria.
say, like in our case, a significant amount of our policy is essentially protect trans youth, protect them, and also protect, and also this applies, for example, to other aspects of healthcare that rely on bodily autonomy. And here in Maryland, we value bodily autonomy, basically. So our premise is simply that that applies also to autistic people. And people are the best judge of what they need, of who they are, especially. I can't get into anyone's brain. I am not one of those body possessing demons or aliens. So we can't get into anybody's brains, and we have to trust what people feel is their true self, what people feel is their identity. And much like in the civility we talk, one of our big priorities is, for example, self-determination, living in the community, the principles of Olmsted, and how both state and federal non-discrimination law embody that it's self-determination that has to apply, that cannot go out the window when the person says, I'm LGBTQ, I'm queer, I'm trans. So that's simply put the way we put it.
Thank you, Victoria. I see, Robin, you're ready. I am grateful, just real quick on Victoria's point, that Maryland is so connected into the valuation of bodily autonomy. And sometimes folks who recognize and address the importance of bodily autonomy in one sphere have trouble and struggle in accepting and understanding bodily autonomy for transgender people. So I'm hoping as we have more conversations like these, that folks can make those connections a little bit better. And part of that is through folks, like our esteemed panelists sharing information both on a scholarly basis and, when folks also want to share information about personal experiences too. Robin, the floor is yours.
I was gonna say, okay, so I'm gonna be sharing personal experience, which is kind of, so my oldest child, I think I mentioned is trans gender and non-binary, and they told me they were trans at 13. Now, you have to know that as a parent, what to expect during the teen years. They're not talking about when your children, come out to you as LGBTQ. They're not telling you. They don't tell you, ways to navigate that, what that means. Um, as parents, there's not really a lot of support or education out there about, things like about bodily autonomy as it applies to gender and confirmation and things like that. As a parent, and especially at the time, I'm living in the South, trying to navigate, okay, how do I get this care for my person? How do I find, um, the right kind of therapist, mental health professionals who support how they feel and support them in their trans journey rather than, trying to like deprogram somebody or something like that. And there's just not, there isn't, but there isn't that support for, parents of trans kids. on, there's like, you have to sit there and cobble it together. I was like, okay, P flag, yay. All right, found parents, friends of lesbians and gays is how it started out, but now it's like the whole umbrella. Um, uh, and there was a very, very large group where the whole separate group for parents of trans children. This is in Atlanta. And but the support so that support group, I learned that the same things are those same issues that I just brought up, of people just like, you don't know what to do, where to go, what hospitals, what doctors are going to be friendly towards gender confirmation, and especially like in the South where they make it, making gender confirmation surgeries and stuff illegal. Like, you can't do that. Like, it was controversial just finding somewhere to, to get tea for my child. And having to, but also like the conversations that you have to have with your friends and family about, like, I got told by my sister-in-law that basically it was child abuse, by allowing my child to bind and to take tea and to use pronouns, the correct pronouns and things like that. Fortunately, school, but having to be that, but also teaching people how to be advocates for their young, for their trans youth. Um, yeah, that's just a piece of it. And then I could also go into intersectional trans issues like race, being a Black community. But that's a whole different topic. But I do think that there has to be more support and guidance for parents of, trans and autistic youth, because that was the other thing too. When I was in my group, probably the majority of the parents, their children were also autistic. So I did find that kind of interesting. But, okay, that is
Thank
what I
you.
have
I'm
to say.
just gonna make a little comment before making sure Jess takes, which is that when you talk about living in the South, I am thinking of the big debate of whether Maryland is still part of the South or not.
I think we're the South of the North and the North of the South. New
Southern
York does not
Northern
consider us the North.
hospitality and Southern efficiency is what JFK described DC as.
Yeah, I would say like New York does not consider us the North, and Atlanta, I'm sure, would not consider us the South. So,
I'm one of
we're in
those.
that.
If they succeeded, did they succeed from the Union during, the Civil War? Then that's kind of like my little line for that. But, because I grew up in Arkansas, and we will fight if anybody says that we're not Southern. Just like,
These conversations can definitely get very personal, and a large debate for sure about those regional connections. Robin, I wanted to ask a brief follow-up. So when you were saying you want, to see more support for parents of trans kids, for parents of autistic kids, and for parents of autistic trans kids, and you're seeing a lot of overlap in some of the groups, that you're a part of. I wanted to ask, I, in my work, run into many parents who are very affirming, many parents, unfortunately, who are not affirming. And I'm wondering for you, was it a process to become affirming, and you don't have to answer this question if you don't want to, but, did you have a process to become affirming, or have you watched folks in your life? I know you were mentioning a family member who was not supportive. Has that person come around? Any tips or tricks that you have for advancing that conversation for that you've found to be effective?
I learned, my own, I did have my own journey with this. I will say that because, due to like heterosexism and, all of those other things, I was thinking, oh, okay, because you've built this whole identity thing in your head, for your kid. But, ultimately, my journey towards this was just being able to recognize that, my child is their own person. They're not an extension of me. They're their own person. They might be part of me because they're my family, but they are their own person with autonomy and the rights for their own body, and they get to make decisions about their life. And I kind of like I had to come about it that way, for me to um uh accept that. But also um it took I know this might sound kind of like, but I went out on the internet and, looked at other trans youth and their families. I don't know if it's, problematic or whatever, but like the I Am Jazz Jennings, that, you know, um watching, like her parents and kind of a little bit of her journey, reading some of that and watching the show. Um, that helped. But as far as conversations with family, I had to also, I mean, there were things I did like with my aunt and stuff, like, sure, because everybody kept wanting to use the dead name. Everyone kept wanting to use the wrong pronouns. And we had to, I had to do, lots of education, but I had to figure out, I found ways to being like, but this is, you know, Lux is their own person. This is Lux's life. You don't get to decide. I don't get to decide. We don't get to put this and make these decisions about what it is that how they identify, whatever. I'm like, I think I might have put it into terms like, I'm like, who you are and how you feel about yourself and how you want to present and how you want the world to see you. Well, this is the same for Lux. This is how Lux sees themselves. This is how they want to present. This is their view, and this is how they want the world to see them and how they see themselves. And that actually, just putting it in plain terms like that, helped a lot. And so they do use they do use Lux's pronouns. They use Lux's name. Um, even I was like, okay, yay, my sisters, like, in this, even though we don't get along, we're estranged, whatever. Um, they're slightly homophobic. Um, they did use Lux's correct name in the program. So I was like, yes, progress. And I also noticed, though, something too. My father, um, my father had Alzheimer's. My father was able to recognize my child's gender that they wanted to be, at the age of 14. you know, with Alzheimer's, they were just to sense it, like, well, this young man, something, something, something. And I was like, oh, I was like, I don't know, someone who, doesn't have all these filters and things right now. If that's what they can feel and see, that to me was, for my oldest, that was hella affirming, for them. But I do see, I don't know, it does help to kind of have kind of a script to talk about it. But I had to learn to how in order to teach other people, I had to come to myself to how, you know, like, more than just accept it, it's like embrace it and support, you know. That's my take.
Really appreciate you sharing that with us and kind of working through how it evolved for you and your family, and and your willingness to share with everyone a few of the techniques and strategies that you were using, both to educate, it sounds like, yourself first, and then develop those talking points, for the other folks in your life. And yeah, I always say, Trans Maryland will, myself and so many, other community leaders will catch, these young people if their families toss them away. But it's a wound that it makes it very difficult, for our community members to fully thrive. And so, when folks do that work like you did, and that you're bringing your, family and your connections along for, it makes just an unbelievable amount of difference. So it's always wonderful to hear from folks, what their process was like, how you got there, and what that really looks like, as we're having these conversations, so that people who are watching this webinar can start to either work through that process for themselves, or get some strategies and talking points or resources, for the other people in their lives. Because, we are not just our family units, we exist in our social structure. So the decisions that our broader and extended family and our communities, our faith community, our neighbors, our schools, etc., all of those have an impact on people. So thank you again for sharing that with us. And then Jess, I think you mentioned you might want to pass on this one. Is that still true? Anything to add? Okay. Wonderful. Well, we can move on. We are a wordy bunch, unsurprisingly, to any of us who have talked with any of us before. I'll move on to our third question. What do you think the autism community should do to become more trans-friendly? And then I'll have the flip side of that being, what do you think the trans community can do to become more neurodiversity friendly? And I won't call on anyone. I learned my lesson this time. So opening up the floor.
Yes, you're on mute.
Jess looks like they would like to remain on mute for a moment. So if anyone would like to start.
Fair.
Can I have the question again? ADHD?
Of course. All right. So the question is two parts. What do you think the autism community can do or should do to become more trans friendly? And what do you think the trans community can do to become more neurodiversity friendly?
All right, I have this.
Great.
So many things. So many things. I think at the root of it is obviously just a lot of trans misogyny, transphobia, and all of that. I think what makes sense to me in terms of aspects of being autistic and advocating for yourself or others or your family members that are like values that should also carry over and be open and welcoming to trans autistic people as well. To me is just like to me is just like there should be a shared value of non-conformity, right? Like that should easily translate to understanding, right, and accepting for nonconformity in many variations, including gender expression and how you live your life. So much of expanding so much of talking about autism, and I'm thinking of settings where you're like maybe trying to explain it to other people or advocate for yourself. So much of it often starts with just like, don't assume things, right? This isn't going to, like, we are not operating on a business as usual, like straight line kind of like agenda here, right? Like things are not what you think they are, something that usually works in one setting won't work here necessarily. But I think within autistic community, it seems like that's like one thing a lot of people can sort of kind of agree on, if they can agree on anything, is that there's nonconformity as a part of it, right? That should easily translate to understanding nonconformity in other aspects of life, but in a lot of ways it really, really doesn't. So that's at least where it could begin, in my view.
Really
I-
appreciate that, Jeff.
I would go ahead when it comes, for example, to the disability and autism community. I would say that the autism community as a whole, and I say very much as a whole, not just self-advocates, not just parents, but everyone in it, need to be more involved in other aspects of disability and other aspects and other civil rights issues and other social justice issues, and that involves acknowledging like being involved in LGBTQ issues, being involved in issues that affect, for example, in the case of parent-led organizations, other issues that affect children, like in this case, the current fight, war by some people against trans children that is being waged. And also be more understanding of atypical, so to speak, families and that also could use those resources and whatnot. So that's my obvious encouragement to many people in the autism world.
This is Xīnzhèn. Just building on the comment that Victoria shared, I see I wouldn't call it astounding, right? Because it's not surprising, but a marked lack of solidarity or intersectional understanding in all marginalized communities. And that is to say, many of us who are on the front lines, we already know this, we live it. We don't have to learn it somewhere. We don't have to go study it somewhere. We know this is our reality. We already live lives that are impacted by so many different forces working against us. And we know that our future and the ability to exercise bodily autonomy and the ability to live freely are all interconnected. But far too many people who hold positions of influence, whether that is in the community, whether that is in government, whether that is in research, whether that is in healthcare, whether that is in social services, do not have this understanding. And that's true in all directions. There is a huge swath of the transgender community that does not understand the importance or the necessity of challenging ableism, ableist policies, ableist practices, ableist values as a means of securing rights and freedom for our community. And you can see this most clearly in the literal decades of activism in the broader queer community and in the trans community specifically, just to have the conditions associated with being queer or trans removed from the American Psychiatric Association's Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders. And so for those who don't know this information, homosexuality used to be listed as a mental disorder in the DSM as recently as the 1980s. And in the same manual that say, for instance, schizoaffective disorder or bipolar disorder or autism are also listed, right? And today, in the current version of the DSM, to be transgender isn't directly or explicitly listed as being a mental disorder, but the condition of gender dysphoria, which by definition occurs in transgender people who experience distress in relation to a misalignment between their body, their appearance, how they are perceived, and how they understand themselves, that is listed in the DSM. And in the immediately previous edition of the DSM, the listing was for gender identity disorder, which was much more clearly analogous to just being transgender, much more clearly connected. And the advocacy in this huge part of the queer and trans community has focused on saying, you know, this is offensive, it's inaccurate, it's outdated, it's offensive, it's prejudiced, it is holding us back from achieving progress. And so we don't want to keep any reference to being queer or being trans listed alongside mental disorders. Now, as somebody who is multiply neurodivergent, I am developmentally disabled, I have psychosocial disabilities, as do many of us in this conversation, right? Like, I actually find that argument and that logic offensive, because what's actually being communicated in this complete lack of solidarity, the complete lack of an intersectional understanding, is that what's offensive is being compared to or connected to people like me, to people like us, right? That somehow it is degrading and undermining our rights and our movement if transgender people are connected to disabled people. Now, to be really clear about it, is being transgender the same thing as being autistic or as having schizoaffective disorder or bipolar disorder? Of course, they're not the same experience, but that doesn't mean that it's offensive or degrading to be compared to, connected with, or spoken about in the same ways as people who are explicitly and definitely in those categories. And in fact, the ways in which we experience a rollback of our rights, the ways that we experience medical ableism, involuntary treatment, forced treatment of all kinds, the ways that we experience denial of autonomy, denial of dignity, the ways that we're criminalized and pathologized, they're really similar, actually, right? So like, even just from a logistical perspective, it does not make sense to just keep focusing on how we need to be separated somehow. And in reality, our struggles are so closely interlinked. The ways in which we are discriminated against and harmed are so closely interlinked. They're parallel, they're overlapping. Sometimes they're the exact same methodology and means and the same policy and the same practice, that it boggles my mind, even though it does not surprise me, that there is this total lack among basically anyone that doesn't live at the intersection. There's this total lack of solidarity, total lack of concern for the ways in which our struggles are so deeply connected. And that, like I said, goes in all directions. That's not just how transgender people who do not identify as disabled have responded to disability. That's also how cisgender disabled people have responded to the trans community. And so I, for one, and I know I hear this from so many of my friends and comrades, am so sick and tired of being asked to pick just one, or being told that even identifying myself is somehow a distraction from so-called real issues, when across the board, our people are under attack. And we will always be stronger when we are working in solidarity with each other, instead of trying to disassociate ourselves from someone that we think is less deserving of rights than we perceive ourselves as being.
Thank you for that, Xīnzhèn. I think the kind of reflecting on what you were mentioning, you know, often say that people don't have an obligation, marginalized folks of any identity don't have an obligation to, or an automatic understanding of other marginalizations. There is, I think, and I guess perhaps, you know, other folks on this panel would say that there should be an obligation to learn and understand better the struggles that our community members across identity experience, because then, you know, we can work together and become aligned towards that larger liberation struggle. But it is unfortunately not always in practice. You know, we don't, I always joke that when you come out, you don't get the handbook or the guide, right? If you do, I'm not on the list, and most people I know have never received this magical handbook that helps us understand all of the other identities under the LGBTQI+ umbrella, for sure. And that goes again with, you know, these intersectional struggles, which when folks live them, You know, often people get like a front row seat, you know, so they're able to certainly understand those struggles on an intimate basis. But the societal pressures and disinclination to acknowledge those struggles is also still prevalent. So you can still be of an identity and then come to find yourself, you know, ascribing to the serious pressures to conform to this outside narrative of non-identification with inherent rights, inherent dignity, et cetera, because those are very disinclined by these very powerful systems that control so much about our daily lives. So really happy to have you know, that analysis going on within this space and into this conversation. And Robin, I think you haven't weighed in, so would love to hear from you if you have a moment or
I
any
think
thoughts.
we're, by the way, about to run out of time, but let's wrap it up with Robin and Jess.
I actually felt like everything was already said about that, but I think that but yes, I know that one of the way that the trans uh community can be um I guess what was it, to be
To be more neurodiversity friendly.
yeah, to be more diversity friendly. I mean, I guess like just I don't know. I feel like just I think that people need to understand that, you know, people that we don't live single issue lives, and you know that that being an intersectional human being is a thing, and that but we need to recognize and support, you know, the different all those, you know, and support the different identities or and things that people can come present as. um you know, uh I I feel I don't really have a whole lot more to say, but yeah, more cross disability, more education on what these things mean, and I don't have an answer for how to do it though right now.
Thank you, Robin. Jess, did you have anything else to add?
No, I went first.
That was just referring, Victoria thought you might have something else. Okay, great. Well, I know because we have an amazing group, we were quite wordy and had a lot to say. I guess if everyone can very briefly, I know this is hard for this group, but I'll ask very briefly share, you know, one sentence if you were going to ask non-autistic people um, uh, who are part of the autism community, such as non-autistic parents or professionals, if you could ask them to do one thing, please be brief, and we will start with Xīnzhèn.
This is Xīnzhèn. When I'm asked the question about allyship, I think of it as a practice, right? It's something that is done. It's something that's done continually. It needs to be done in relationship. It needs to be done with reciprocity. And it needs to involve a real exchange of resources or a sacrifice of privilege. Otherwise, it's not allyship, it's performativity.
Thank you so much, Jess.
Please center autistic people in the work that you're doing. Listen to them, cite them, invite them to things, pay them to do things. That's what I would say.
Thank you for that, Victoria.
I mean, trust trans people to tell the truth about who they are.
Amazing. Robin?
You meet one person with autism, you have met one person with autism. All we don't all present and act and think the same ways. And I think that that is very important for people to recognize.
Excellent. Yeah, this is such a diverse community. Wonderful. Well, that brings us to the end of our time together. We're really grateful for everybody taking some time out of their day to join us for this really important discussion. Happy Pride Month again, and to everyone who is, I would say, going through it a little bit in the LGBTQI plus community, and specifically the trans community at this time due to the targeting that we're undergoing from the federal administration. Right now, we really, it's so important to take that extra time to both care for ourselves and then to practice community care and interconnectedness right now. So really hoping that folks can place that attention and do what you need to do in order to take care of yourself, whether it is turning off the news, whether it is reaching out to your community and letting folks know that you need some extra support, things like that. So thank you again for joining us for our discussion on gender diversity and transgender identities in the autistic community. And please stay tuned to the websites and resources that we'll be able to share as part of this going out. Thank you again.